2 weeks ago, I traveled to Louisiana with Stetson Studio, CC Minis, and Bill making stuff. We went on an adventure looking for our friend Tinu of Craftastrophe and another friend you might know, Craftsman of Steady Craftin'. It was quite the trip. Let me tell you about it. After picking a base and printing some alligators, I realized that I needed a boat. I couldn't find one, so I'll be scratch building one today using some pieces of styrene. And in case you get confused, I'll be mixing the story of our trip in with the narration of this build. We all met up in New Orleans and went out for fried chicken for dinner, which was served to us by a pirate who had a fondness for applewood. He made fun of Bill a little bit, but at least his chicken was good. After dinner, we walked back to our lodging as it began to pour rain, but we made it inside just in time before the lightning started. The next morning, we started things off right by eating French toast and beignets. It was a breakfast to champions. We spent the rest of the day walking off the carbs and sugar by wandering around the city, watching riverboats, looking at little shops, and listening to live jazz. The next day, we set out for Tinu's. After completing the base shape of the boat with the styrene, I kit bashed a motor and propeller housing from an old speaker. Just like the famous bear hunting family, we encountered a muddy swamp on our way to Tinu's house. Luckily, we didn't have to squelch our way through the mud because we hired a guide to ferry us across on his fan boat. There were a few different options for boat rides available. We decided to go with the budget option. Our guide had a cool fan boat that he'd fabricated himself by welding a lawnmower to a small jungle gym that he placed in one end of a metal kiddie pool. I did my best to recreate the look of his boat in this diorama. I added some thin styrene rods to the side of the boat to give it better detail and create visual interest, and I then created the jungle gym frame to mount on the back of the boat using some thicker styrene rods. After we all got situated in the boat, we set out across the swamp. We were making some pretty good progress when unfortunately the motor just shut off and the boat glided to a halt in the middle of nowhere. It was a good distance from the nearest shore as well. Apparently a nutria rat had been messing with the motor and the guide hadn't noticed. You can add that to your list of reasons to dislike nutria rats. After putting a little driver's seat in place, I made a propeller out of a piece of styrene and I put it on a little shaft. Then I mounted it to the center of the speaker. The bleacher seating on this fine watercraft had been taken from a local high school using the magic of an angle grinder. My guess is that it was a rival school. I used some sprue pieces to make the handrails behind the seats, and I lined the floor of the boat with some diamond patterned styrene. I probably should have done this before putting the benches in place, but that's okay. I'll remember to do that next time. I threw on some final details, including a little driver's stick, and that was the little fan boat done. Next, it was time to take everything outside to prime. I gave the miniatures a zenithal highlight and I primed the base black. Because we were dead in the water without the deafening noise from the fan, we took the opportunity to ask some questions of the guide while he worked on the motor. He said he lived in the swamp his whole life, so I asked him how often he saw skunk apes or rougarous. He said he hadn't ever seen one, which caused me to question if he really had spent that much time in the swamp after all, especially given the frequency of their reported sightings just down the road in Florida. The first alligator that approached the boat was a big one that the guide was familiar with. Its name was Fred. The guide handed Bill a bag of marshmallows to distract the alligators while he worked on the engine. The commotion of the broken down boat and the promise of marshmallows quickly attracted a whole crowd of alligators. As you can see, I ripped up a piece of sponge to dab some paint over top of the rusty base colors. I made sure to give it that nice derelict playground lawnmower kiddie pool feel. After painting the boat, I painted the base. I gave it a splotchy dark green base color, just in case any of it showed through the resin. After that was painted, I cut up and glued some acrylic walls to the outside of the base to hold the resin in place while it cured. I glued the walls in place with some silicone adhesive. This forms a nice sturdy bond and makes it watertight as well. I then glued the boat and the alligators in place, and I left the silicone to cure for 24 hours before it was ready to hold the resin. This project consisted of 2 shallow pours, each a 1/16 of an inch deep, which meant I could use a faster curing resin than I normally do. Usually I use a deep pour resin, but in this case I only printed the upper half of the alligators so they would appear deeper in the water to begin with. I added 4 drops of opaque pigment to the first batch of resin, and then I gave it a dark, greenish brown swamp watercolor. I stirred the resin and transferred it back and forth between mixing vessels till it was thoroughly blended, and then it was time to pour. I used a stick to help guide the resin in and around the boat and alligators, as well as prevent larger bubbles from forming. I teased it into the hard-to-reach areas as well, and it leveled itself out. I tended to the surface for about an hour with a blowtorch, popping all the micro bubbles as they rose to the surface. I then left it overnight and repeated the same process, but this time with a much nastier color of resin. After popping the bubbles on that second pour, I left the base to cure fully, and I moved on to the minis. My friend Bill making stuff is best known for 2 things, his cat and his twin brother Dan. Another less well-known thing about him is that he likes to make little robots from beads, that he refers to as beadbots. I've never made a beadbot before. For this diorama, I decided it would be only fitting to depict Bill as one of those little beadbots. I was also sure to make the beadbot in heroic scale to match the other minis. In case you forgot, Bill was holding a bag of marshmallows where we left off. Bill was trying to get it open and having some trouble when it slipped out of his hands and fell into the water. As we all know, robots don't have the best grip due to a lack of fingerprints, but that fact must have slipped the guide's mind. Anyway, when Bill instinctively reached in the water to grab the bag, his hand was bitten off by Fred. The guide saw what happened and jumped in the water to wrestle Bill's hand free, but was unfortunately eaten by Fred as well. After finishing up the beadbot, I prepped all the minis for painting by putting them on some wargaming bases. I'm representing myself as this little cowboy that I made in Hero Forge, Nick from CC Minis is this little Viking, and Stutson Studio is this little Link from The Legend of Zelda. After priming all of the minis with the Zenithal highlight, it was time to paint. While I paint, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. You guys are the best. I chose to portray Stutson as Link from Zelda because he's made some really cool Zelda-themed craft projects, and the blue of his profile picture is pretty close to the blue of Link's champion tunic. He also looks just like Link. In fact, I used a real-life photo of Stutson that I took in New Orleans as my reference while I was painting Link's face. Bill the Beadbot got an all-encompassing base coat of rust, followed by stippled-on spots of color for his various components. I also added some glossy green hydraulic fluid coming out of where his hand used to be. Nick is a great mini painter, so I spent a little extra time painting him. On our first full day in New Orleans, that was the French toast and beignet day, Nick wore a memorable dark blue shirt covered in oranges. As I was painting this little miniature Nick, I wanted to make sure that he was wearing the same dark blue shirt covered in oranges. The last mini to paint was me. Bill was obviously in a pretty bad mood after losing his hand, so I handed him a banana to cheer him up. I peeled it for him because I knew he couldn't do it with just one hand. I also painted the classic boy-lie orange and white stripes on my tie, and once the minis were done, it was time to finish up the base. At this point, the resin had fully cured, so it was time to peel off the acrylic. I then gave the water's surface some texture using some gloss Mod Podge. While I wrap up this diorama, let me finish up the story as well. Luckily, the guide had managed to fix the issue with the engine before he leaped in the water to rescue Bill's hand. We couldn't figure out how to start the engine up, but then we remembered that it was just a lawnmower attached to a kiddie pool. Stutson pulled the cord a few times real fast and the engine kicked on. He then steered the boat away from the mob of alligators and safely through the rest of the swamp. Once we were out of the swamp, we stopped by Whole Foods real quick, just so that we weren't showing up at Tinu's house empty-handed. And we were astonished by who we ran into at Whole Foods. It was none other than the swamp guide himself. We asked him how he survived the alligators, and he said that 2 raccoons had jumped in and saved him. We thought that was pretty neat. After spreading some duckweed across the surface of the water, I glued all the minis in place. After that, I called it good. made this video a little more goofy than normal, but in all seriousness, it was an incredible and encouraging trip. Definitely something I'll remember forever. After Tinu so graciously allowed us to come crash at his house, we made a trip over to Craftsman's, which was a real treat. All of these crafters who I've looked up to as inspirations on YouTube, I'm very happy to be able to consider real-life friends now. If you aren't subscribed to any of them, you should definitely go do that. They're awesome. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.